Philippe Fargues was born in Paris in 1948 and completed all of his university degrees there at the Sorbonne, earning his doctorate in 1974. He has completed parallel specialized training in demography and in Arabic language at other Paris universities. While still completing his graduate studies, he also served as a lecturer in demography at the University of Beirut in Lebanon and at the UN Institute for Demographic Training and Research in French-speaking Africa in Yaoundé and Cameroon. For nearly 2 decades, he devoted himself to work in international demographic training and research centers, including Abidjan, Ivory Coast, and Cairo, Egypt, while he maintained formal ties with the French National Institute for Demographic Research in Paris. For the past 20 years, he has held leadership positions at INED and other international research centers as one of the leading scholars of international migration processes. This article from 2004 was written while he was serving as co-director of the Florence School on Mediterranean Migration and Development at the University of Florence in Italy. Starting from the idea that the demographic transition may generate a push for e-migration due to rapid population growth, Fargues shows us the other side of this coin, that once these migrants begin to adapt to their new host societies, they in turn may be having an effect on the demographic transition back home.
The study of birth rates and death rates, the starting points and ending points of our lives, the discipline of demography generally has treated the study of population movements as a kind of unplanned younger sibling. This is probably because migration is less predictable than fertility or mortality, and demographers apparently love orderly, predictable formulas above all things. It is true that there have been attempts to resolve population movements into simple, clean mathematical formulas, such as the so-called gravity model borrowed from physics. Instead of planets, this model looks at populations. The idea is that populations exert a kind of gravitational attraction on each other, pulling people across the gap between them as migrants. The number of migrants, by this analogy, should be proportional to the mass or size of the two populations and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. If you want to get fancy, you can even modify what you mean by distance to include not only physical, geographic distance, but also figurative social or economic distance, which is greater when two populations speak different languages, follow different religions, or live at different economic levels. But these models usually are unsatisfying because although there may be some vague truth to these factors predicting population movements, usually the flood of unusual historical, political, and economic events drowns the abstract predictions of the gravity model in wild and crazy fluctuations. Still, these efforts to explain migration from the perspective of the sending and receiving populations, their sizes, their characteristics, continue to tempt scholars to keep on trying to find just the right formulas. If we turn the telescope of demographic analysis around and look at population movements through the other end, from the perspective of each individual migrant rather than from a macro-level societal perspective, there's another established body of theories and predictions about migration. From this individualized perspective, the underlying driving force for movements of people is not an abstract principle borrowed from physics, but motivational analysis based on psychological and economic explanations. The bottom line of these explanations is that a person moves from one house to another, or from one city to another, or even from one country to another, because he or she wants to. These motivational theories are at least as unsatisfying as the gravity model in the end. This kind of explanation is something like saying that if you are the victim of a holdup in a dark alley one night, you give the robber your money because you want to. Otherwise, you'll be dead. In some sense or other, everything we do is always done because we want to, but the really important questions are never answered by this. The important questions are, why do you want to move? What forces combine to create this attitude? Even refugees fleeing persecution and death are moving because they want to, because they prefer to be alive instead of dead, even if it means abandoning everything they ever knew. So in order to make these motivational theories more satisfying, we have to embed them in some larger theoretical, explanatory, logical perspective. The current dominant explanation for why people want to move from one place to another reflects the contemporary preoccupation of social scientists with rational choice theory, which assumes that all the choices we make are attempts to improve our situation in some way. This translates into attempts to measure the situations in which people find themselves living, usually expressing these situations in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of economic interactions. If you stay where you are, what kind of job can you find? How much money can you earn? How much does it cost to find a place to live, to pay for your food and transportation? In other words, we total up the costs and benefits of life for any particular person in any particular place. If that person sees a healthy surplus of benefits over costs, he or she may stay right there. On the other hand, if this person looks around and sees that a larger surplus of benefits over costs, or in really desperate situations, a smaller surplus of costs over benefits, is available someplace else, he or she should pack up and move. Migration, like absolutely everything else we do in the course of our lives, should be a rational attempt to find a better balance of costs and benefits. The classic rational choice model of migration summarizes the comparison between where you are and where you might go in terms of push factors that might be encouraging you to leave, such as low pay, uncertainty of employment, or other things such as noisy neighbors, heavy traffic, too much pollution, crime in the streets, or maybe even the weather, and pull factors that might be attracting you to a new destination, such as higher pay, job security, cultural and recreational opportunities, or a better climate. The trouble with these rational choice models is that absolutely anything could be tossed into the hopper as a plausible push or pull consideration, so that it becomes difficult to decide how to weight the importance of all these factors. It is an essentially static explanation that does not deal with how each place got to be the way it is, but just bounces people around based on those current characteristics. In its own way, it is every bit as abstract an explanation as the gravity model used from the perspective of populations instead of individuals. It explains nothing until you fill up the categories of push and pull factors with specific, measured characteristics of life in each place. For our purposes here, we will fill up these categories of push and pull factors with ideas from that other theoretical framework that has followed us everywhere so far, the process of the demographic transition. Fargues explicitly links these two topics of migration and demographic transition in a way that usually has not appeared until now. For the most part, demographic transition theory, like demography in general, tends to focus on births and deaths. The standard four-stage image of the transition only has two lines in it, the birth rate and the death rate. The stages themselves are defined purely in terms of these two demographic measures. When both are high, you're in stage 1. When both are low, you're in stage 4. In between, in stage 2, most of the action is found in the death rate, while in stage 3, most of the action is found in the birth rate. Where does migration fit into all of this? The traditional demographic answer is that it simply doesn't. But there is a kind of sideshow in some studies of the demographic transition. For example, Dorothy Swain Thomas wrote a classic book about the transition in Sweden, showing that when the gap between a falling death rate and a persistent high birth rate creates rapid population growth, all those extra people often tend to move away, that is, to migrate. They may start by migrating from the countryside into the cities, but if there's nothing going on for them in the cities, they may get on boats or trains or other conveyances and become international migrants. This is what Fargues has in mind when he talks about migration as a response to the demographic transition. Population growth itself becomes the classic, ultimate push factor that propels migrants out of a suddenly growing population. This idea accounts rather well for my own family history. All 4 of my grandparents left Norway and Sweden in the middle of the demographic transition in those countries. Children growing up in large families where few or none of the babies were dying any longer, and where the opportunities for future lives looked distinctly small and bleak. They took off to the city and then got on ships and came to America. It is a story that has been repeated millions and millions of times, and Fargues accepts it as one side of the coin of how migration is related to demographic transition. In fact, you can make a reasonable argument that most of the really large population movements of recent history have represented responses to the push of rapid population growth stimulated by falling death rates in the course of demographic transitions. Of course, Fargues is careful to recognize that not all international migration follows this simple logic. But the largest flow of migrants in the contemporary world is indeed from developing to developed countries, while hardly anybody is moving in the opposite direction. There are also substantial currents of people moving around among the developed countries themselves, and also mobility between countries within the developing world. But if we zero in on the individuals involved, it is an article of faith, particularly among economists, that even such circular migration will turn out to have a rational choice explanation if you can just find the right things to place on the balance of costs and benefits, so that the balance tips towards the observed population movements. But the main point that Fargues wants to make is quite different from this well-recognized link between demographic transition and resulting migratory movements. To this picture of migration as a response to transitions, he wants to add the other side of the coin, the idea that such migration may have some kind of feedback effect on the demographic transition itself. Doing research that has portrayed international migration as a byproduct of demographic transition, a kind of safety valve in society that might relieve the pressure of rapid population growth, Fargues turns to his intriguing idea that such migratory movements may also end up having a kind of feedback effect on the society from which the migrants departed. Migration as safety valve side of this coin has been around for quite some time, and even has been used to explain why many European countries had such a successful demographic transition, while populations in some developing countries today seem to be stuck in the second stage of falling death rates and high birth rates, unable to shift into third gear and get on with their transitions. In the modern era of stricter controls on international population movements, they may simply lack the luxury of a safety valve of international migration to relieve the pressure of rapid growth. That surplus of population pressure keeps building up and may short-circuit progress through the rest of the transition by eating up all the capital that should have been available for continued modernization and development. Migration option landed these countries in a development trap that locks them into the second stage of the demographic transition and prevents further progress. When Fargues turns this theoretical coin over to look at the other side, at the argument that international migration is more than just a byproduct and that it actually can affect the course of the demographic transition that prompted it in the first place, we're on more unfamiliar territory. Just how would such a feedback effect work? Why would we expect such a thing to happen? The language adopted by Fargues to spell this out for us brings in a concept we already have run into a different form, the idea of remittances sent back home by migrants who have moved away. We have seen these remittances in the form most familiar to people who study issues of migration and development, financial remittances. If you go to the Western Union desk inside supermarkets and other stores in the United States on a Friday afternoon, after farm workers and hospitality workers and other occupations filled with large numbers of foreign immigrants have gotten their paychecks for the week, you will see people lined up to send money back home to Mexico or to Guatemala or to other Latin American countries. Many countries in the developing world depend on these financial remittances for a substantial fraction of their gross national product and to balance the costs of all the expensive things they are importing from those same developed countries that employ their migratory former residents. But Fargues has a very different kind of remittance in mind. He calls these ideational remittances. In other words, migrants from Ethiopia or Afghanistan or El Salvador, who are now living and working in London or Chicago or Frankfurt, send home a lot more than money. This was always the case. In the 1800s, migrants to the United States would write letters home, telling about their adventures in a land where the streets were paved with gold. Back at home in the village, in the old country, these letters passed from hand to hand like wildfire. In some cases, they generated so much excitement that whole villages simply packed up and took off for the city, heading for a boat that would take them over the seas to join these early pioneers who apparently had found the best rational choice of all. You still can fly over some rural spots in the European countryside and see dark stains on the land where a village used to be, before all its inhabitants took off for the New World as migrants. But these early examples of a feedback effect of migrants on their communities of origin deal almost exclusively with a reinforcement of the migration stream itself. Communications were simply too expensive, too slow, and inefficient in those earlier times to allow the kinds of effects that Fargues is thinking about in this article. The heart of his argument is that once migrants cross over from their original societies to a new home in a new country, they begin to change. This is nothing less than one of the fundamental insights of social science, that people are continually shaped and changed by the web of social interactions in which they're always enmeshed. When that social network is radically reconfigured as a result of migration from one society to another, and people find themselves living in the midst of new rules of everyday life, they adapt. They learn new languages, form new opinions, and make new friends. If they stay, their children become even more acculturated and then come home from school and reshape their parents as well. This has always been the case for immigrants in almost every society, at least to the extent that they were allowed to join into the new mainstream. In cases where immigrants may be reviled and isolated, this kind of acculturation goes more slowly, if at all, but still the people are changed by this experience. In particular, since Fargues is concentrating on demographic processes, he is interested in how the migration experience shapes the attitudes and behavior of people when it comes to getting married and having babies. He examines a wide range of studies and evidence showing that immigrants tend to adapt not only to new foods or to new worlds of work and leisure, but also to the reproductive and family patterns of the new host society. Most important for his argument, when people come from a culture where powerful, organized kinship lineages controlled life and dictated early marriages and large families, migrants will be greatly affected when they find themselves in a new society where kin-based patronage is viewed as corruption and unfair favoritism, and where small families are the norm around which everything is structured, including the shape of available housing and transportation, the costs of education, and the attitudes of their employers. Fargues understands that the decisions made by these immigrants about whether or not to get married, when to get married, who they will marry, and how they will manage the whole subject of having children will often be drastically different in the new destination country than it would have been back at home where they started. This was also true in the past, of course. Irish and German immigrants in the 1800s, who came from very large families at home, sometimes never managed to marry at all or married very late. Struggling to make a life in a new and unfamiliar setting, they may have adopted the old saying that he travels fastest who travels alone, and avoided the complications of family life in order to get ahead. But in those days, this adaptive behavior in the new host country had little direct impact back where they came from. This is what Fargues says has changed today. Immigrants today live what he called transnational lives. They don't have to write a letter, which will take a month to make a round trip and get an answer back. They can just tap on their cell phones and talk to their relatives on the far side of the planet. They can jump on a plane, if they're doing well enough to afford the ticket, and actually be back in their relatives' houses in a single day. And what is more, some of those relatives may come and visit them in Hamburg or Atlanta, too. So Fargues says that these international migrants remain in direct, significant contact with the population that they left behind. The people in their village, their neighbors, and their cousins are vicariously experiencing the social and economic contracts that are transforming the lives of such migrants. And Fargues believes that this unprecedented level of insight into the new world experienced by immigrants is deeply affecting the communities from which they originated. What this has to do with birth rates and the demographic transition then becomes clear in his next argument. I already have said about today's immigrants, the conclusions reached by Fargues are little more than simple arithmetic. The family and reproductive choices of immigrants can be drastically affected by life in a completely new cultural context. These immigrants also stay in continuous direct contact with many of the people living back in the society from which they came. As a result, this direct, continuous contact can transmit the new ways of thinking about marriage and childbearing directly back into the sending societies. 1 + 1 = 2. It just adds up logically. So Fargues argues that the new attitudes of immigrants today have a significant feedback effect in the population that they left behind. The new ideas picked up in the destination society and transmitted back home via mobile phones and personal visits can accelerate the demographic transition to later marriages and fewer children. Particularly when migrants to more advanced economies are doing well and are perceived as successful role models, it is easy to see how people still living in the communities of origin might want to imitate their successful relatives. This imitation could very likely include the timing of marriages and subsequent births, and not just hairstyles or fashions in clothing and music. Fargues demonstrates the importance of these migrants as role models back at home by contrasting two different migrant streams. In both cases, lots of migrants moved from relatively impoverished origins, some in disadvantaged regions of Turkey and some in disadvantaged areas of Egypt. But in the case of Turkey, the migrants went to Western Europe, where they encountered societies that have produced some of the lowest birth rates in the world. In contrast, the workers from Egypt were more likely to migrate to the Gulf states like Kuwait, Bahrain, or the United Arab Emirates, where the economies are also very highly developed and standards of living and wages are high, but where very traditional family-based social organization remains intact and powerful. In both cases, the migrants got good jobs and made more money than they could have done at home. In both cases, they remitted financial resources back home. But in the case of the Turks experiencing Western Europe, Fargues says that they also sent home ideational remittances about delayed marriage and small families as integral features of a high standard of living. And he argues that this had an important role in helping reduce the birth rate in Turkey to approximately replacement level today. In the case of Egyptian workers in the Gulf states, the very traditional ideational remittances that were communicated back to Egypt had more to do with kin-based patronage and traditional attitudes about early marriage and lots of children to strengthen such kin groups. As a result, the Egyptian birth rate may actually have been stimulated by these ideational remittances instead of lowered. Clearly, says Fargues, the new context experienced by the migrants makes a difference in their own lives, and he believes that they can then transmit this difference back home and affect the progress or lack of progress through the demographic transition among their friends and relatives who stayed behind. This completes a feedback loop in the relationship between migration and demographic transition. Just as the migrants sent back new ideas that at least potentially could accelerate a demographic transition and encourage fertility decline at home, once that origin society begins to complete the transition to low birth as well as death rates, that transition will affect the migrant stream in its turn. Later marriage and a lower birth rate will mean that the origin society will begin to grow older. So the people who are available as the next generation of migrants from that country will also be older, and they will be more educated, and fewer of them will be married or have families. When these single migrants arrive in the destination countries, they will be less embedded in traditional cultural communities specific to their origins, and more likely to be shaped and changed by the new destination culture. They may even be more likely to form new families with members of the new host society. Since they do not have spouses or children left behind in the old country, they'll be less likely to send back financial remittances. And the ideational remittances that they send back with their mobile phones will further accelerate cultural change in their communities of origin. So migrants get new ideas, and then those new ideas travel back home and change the society from which they left. These changes then alter the types of people who are migrating in the next iteration of the process, and the two sides of this coin keep flipping back and forth, steadily knitting the origin and destination cultures together more and more closely and causing them to converge in many ways. This way of looking at migrants and migration as a process gets us well beyond the older view that migration as a process was merely a byproduct of the demographic transition, and that migrants were more or less passive victims of culture shock who had to live out confused lives where they no longer really belonged in either place. Fargues takes us back closer to something like the picture presented by Robert Park almost a century ago, when he talked about the marginality of migrants as a creative force in society. Park was talking about this creative force in the life of the destination society where migrants end up, but Fargues shows us that this same creative force may flow from migrants back to the societies that they have left behind as well. Particularly if you are a migrant yourself, this is no doubt a more pleasant, empowering way to look at things.